Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
How long does it take to get defensive? What kind of impact does it have? In today's program, you will learn how to diffuse defensiveness, whether you are talking to a coworker or a manager needing to give feedback to an employee. Hello, I'm your guest host, Stephen Kotev, and joining us today for our program entitled Taking the War Out of Our Words, Turning Conflict into Conversation in the Workplace is Sharon Ellison. Sharon Strand Ellison is an international consultant, pioneer in the field of eliminating defensiveness, and author of Taking the War Out of Our Words. A nominee for Leadership in a Changing World, Sharon has been a keynote speaker for the Texas Bar Association, Center for Dispute Resolution, London, England, and the Smithsonian Institute. She's provided training for organizations in more than a dozen professions, including Hewlett Packard, the U.S. Department of Justice, Wells Fargo, Kaiser Permanente, and the United Way. Welcome to the program, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you. And I must say that you've got a wonderful way with words. And so I'm very curious, how did you learn to take the war out of words, which is the title of your book and the title of today's program?
Well, I can't confess to having totally learned it. I think we're all a work in progress. But, from the time I was a child, it never made sense to me when I would hear people say that it was just human nature to be violent. It always seemed more like an illness to me. And without realizing what I was going to ultimately do, I just kept watching people and thinking about why there was so much needless conflict in people's lives and why people would say, I'm not going to let her know she hurt me. And I would think, well, how can you solve it if you don't let the person know? And gradually I began to develop a program for teaching communication skills that was my own take on things. And people started saying that it was so revolutionary and disarming. And this is quite a long time ago. The word disarming was not used much with regard to communication in those days. And so, interestingly, because I'm a very curious person, I never asked anybody directly what they meant by disarming. So one day I sat in my living room and I kept thinking, what am I teaching about communication that's disarming? And then I realized that in the war, at the end of the war, when you disarm, literally you take the rifle off your shoulder and set it on the ground. So I asked myself what I was teaching that was causing people to lay down their defenses, and I suddenly realized I was teaching a way to communicate where you don't have to get defensive no matter what the other person does. And that's when the bigger light bulb came on, and I realized that the whole infrastructure that we've used for talking to each other is based on the rules of war. So I did another thing that kind of surprised me then and now. I went to the dictionary and looked up the word question and discovered that it was never defined ever with the word curiosity, but it was defined over and over again with the word interrogation. In fact, an old definition of the word question was torture during a trial, like the Inquisitions. And then I looked up how to make a statement, and it talked about convincing and persuading people. And the word prediction would talk about how to set boundaries or predict things in a way that was sort of like doomsday and controlling. And I suddenly realized that we were using all these communication tools, questions, statements, and predictions, in a way that was prompting, they were all being used to manipulate and control other people. And, none of us want to be controlled by somebody else usually, so we resist and we get into power struggles. And After that, what I did, and this is something that I can teach it to third graders, those of us who are grown-ups, it's a little bit harder because we have much more ingrained habits, but I looked at and changed how we ask questions so that instead of them being interrogating, they became based on pure curiosity, and instead of trying to convince people to agree, how to make a statement or even give feedback in a way that people feel respected, but you can still have a strong, clear opinion yourself, and also how to create boundaries in a way that prompts people to become more competent and reciprocal instead of feeling controlled and punished. So I basically changed several things, and I can describe to you the change specifically so that people can, it's a fairly simple change to begin to practice. Would you like me to share that about how to ask a question, for example?
Well, yeah, I think you definitely have another like-minded, curious person in myself, and I think our listeners are also very curious about this, because I definitely want to understand, what it is, and we would love some examples. I also think it's very interesting that it seems like one of the fundamental choices that you made in the work that you've done and in helping folks disarm is literally to take a look at what is the intention behind the words that we use, because it seems that you were very intentional in trying to find a term like curiosity that is not at all connected to anything aggressive in the dictionary, at least that I know of, versus some of these other terms like questioning that was, the old terms were much more akin to interrogation. Is that right?
Yes. And what I realized is that for literally many, many centuries, we have been asking questions in a way where even when we try to show concern, people will frown and kind of shake their head. And they'll say, "Oh, are you upset about something?" And they're frowning, but that frown really reflects the old system of interrogation. It doesn't look friendly and it doesn't look inviting. We've also learned to ask questions coming up at the end. So a supervisor might say to somebody, what made you approach the problem that way? And what do you hear, Stephen, when I ask it that way? Most people hear judgment,
right.
and there's a push to it. So what we know now, according to people like Dr. Joseph Ledoux, who have studied the physiology of defensiveness, is that the minute we feel any kind of threat, all the neurons in the brain fire completely past the complex problem-solving part, and they go straight to fight or flight. So, and what they say, these are actually my words that summarize some of their philosophy and their research, that all it takes for anybody to get defensive is for anybody to do anything that anybody ever did in your life. And so we're all kind of just waiting to fall off the cliff into our own defensiveness, but what we're not realizing is that we're constantly unconsciously prompting each other's defenses. Now, if I change my tone, if I say, "Are you upset about something?" I ask an audience, "What message do you hear?" And they hear everything from, "You've already decided I'm upset," to "Get over it," to "It's a demand for an answer." A few people will hear it as compassion, but most people don't. But now I'll model for you, and actually I have a ton of free information on my website, so you can listen to cuts from my CDs and practice, practice the tone. But I'll ask you, when I shift from saying, "Are you upset about something?" And now I ask it this way, if you would just tell me what you feel inside when I shift the way I'm asking it. Are you feeling upset? Are you feeling upset about something?
It feels like there's more of a concern in what you're asking versus either the first one could be judgment, or you may not have that much of an investment in myself. The versus, it's kind of what the first one felt like versus the second one.
And what's fascinating is the way I got that was instead of trying to show concern on my face when I ask the question, which comes out as a frown, and often people will actually shake their head, like as if they're saying no to something. Like, "Are you upset about something?" I call it the defensive shimmy. And the only thing I've done is I've gotten rid of all that facial expression, and I've I've adopted a way of being present with somebody without trying to send any message of concern, because it contaminates the question. If I ask you in a way that's very, are you okay, Stephen? Or were you having a hard time with that project at work? When I ask it that way, you might feel like I'm smothering, or you might feel like I don't trust you. People will read into that tone of voice and the facial expressions. So I leave my face pretty relaxed, and I come down at the end of the question, just like a balloon floating to the ground, but it's firm. So instead of saying, should we make a decision now, or should we wait till we get more data? I want to say, do you think we should make the decision now, or do you think we should wait till we get more data? And there's just a huge difference in the response. And what I have learned is that that when I ask a question that way, people will often drop their defenses absolutely instantly. And one woman who was a mediator wrote to me and said, I can see how this process works, but how is it that adrenaline rush when we get defensive can just disappear instantly? I mean, usually it takes at least 20 minutes to an hour, or we might even think 10 years later what we could have said to somebody. And the reason it happens is because you can't talk someone out of being defensive, but if you do anything that prompts the person to feel a different kind of feeling, then they can drop their defenses instantly as fast as they came up, with none of that residue of the adrenaline rush. So you can transform a conversation instantly. I've had supervisors who were talking to employees who were one supervisor had an employee come to her and say, she was a new employee, and she said, you just get so upset and angry with me when I make a mistake. And this supervisor usually would have reassured the person, and that's really a pitfall. She would have said, I'm not upset with you, but how likely is it that employee is going to believe that? So I recommend using that down tone and the relaxed facial expression and asking a question instead. And this supervisor shifted and did something different than what she usually would have done, and she said to the employee, what is it that I'm doing that makes you think that I'm angry at you? And the employee said, you're sighing and rolling your eyes whenever I make a mistake. And the supervisor was so shocked. She had no idea she was doing that. And she said, I don't think I'm angry at you. I think that I'm concerned that I'm not giving you instructions clearly enough. And from that moment on, the learning process, both for the supervisor and for the employee, was so much better.
Mm-hmm. So this is really fascinating. And so by basically changing two things, you get a huge difference in response from the people you're engaging with. One is what you're doing with your face, and then the second is, and I'm not saying that maybe as elegantly as you are, but what shape your face is in, and then how you say the words, how you say the question. And so the first one is, right? Go ahead.
Well, just to add a little bit to that, I actually changed 4 things. The first thing you talked about that's so important is intention. My intention has to be pure curiosity. If that supervisor said, what am I doing that makes you think I'm angry? The employee is going to totally shut down, because with that tone of voice, and maybe with the intention to defend a little bit, like I'm not doing anything, I'm not angry, that's going to shut down the conversation. So my intention in the question has to be pure curiosity, and then I want to alter my my voice tone and come down at the end, and my facial expression, so that it's relaxed rather than frowning or raising my eyebrows or shrugging my shoulders. And the final thing is that sometimes, not always, but sometimes I will also change the phrasing a little bit. It makes it a little softer. Like instead of just saying, are you upset about something, I might say, are you feeling upset about something? And it just gives it rounds it out a little bit more softly.
So I want to remind our listeners that they're listening to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk radio program with your guest host, myself, Stephen Kotev. Today I am joined by Sharon Ellison, and we are discussing taking the war out of our words, turning conflict into conversation in the workplace. So going back over your 4 points, so the first is stay curious or embrace the intention of being curious when you're engaging with folks. When you ask your question to come down at the end, not to come up. Try to have a relaxed facial expression, and possibly, if you need to change the phrasing. So you've done a great job in modeling that for me. I'm not sure if you want to do a little bit more modeling, or, what I think is also interesting for folks is the application components, and if you have some more advice on how to do this and how to, say, deal with somebody who may be possibly resistant to feedback.
Yes. And I'll pop in two other things. Now, we've talked about the question, and I do change intention, voice tone, and body language also in statements, which has two parts when I give feedback to the other person or say my own thoughts, feelings, and beliefs. And for the statements, what I want to do is I want to tell the other person what's going on like I would tell a story. Because when you tell your chronological story, when you said this, then I thought you meant that, and so I had this reaction, instead of, well, you were being really judgmental of me. So I'm letting the person know how I got to my conclusions, and I do it like a story, and people can hear almost anything then. And then the third form of communication is predictions. So when I let someone know the choices, my intention is to create security and predictability, not to control or punish. So if I say to an employee, if you continue to come in late, then this is the kind of consequence we'll create. I'm using the if-then phrase, but I'm doing it as a way to create predictability. Many times employees complain that no one ever told them about a problem, and then suddenly they get a write-up when they get their review. And so I want to tell people ahead of time, here's the change I want to see you make. If you make it, this will be the consequence. If you don't make it, this will be the consequence. And as far as modeling, say you're in a meeting, one of the things that happens a lot of times in meetings is that people interrupt. And people who tend to be more verbally active often will jump in, and it's not always an intentional insult. It may just be that they're not paying attention to the fact that the other person hasn't finished. And so people get very frustrated. Supervisors often don't do something to intervene because nobody wants to, create a conflict. So a simple question that either a supervisor could ask or the employee could ask of someone else would be, if someone has interrupted them once or twice, when it happens again, to simply say to the person, would you be willing to wait until I'm finished? And frequently, that's all it takes. And it's not aggressive, but it's really still also holding the other person accountable for making a decision that helps the meeting to carry on in a respectful way. If you're supervising someone, I'm going to jump for a moment to the issue of people being resistant. There's a book written called Mistakes Were Made, But Not by Me. And I think it's a great book, and it has a lot of data about how human beings don't like to take accountability. But from my perspective, that's only true through the lens of this war model that we've had, because in war, one person or the other has the power. So oftentimes people feel like they have to defend themselves and they don't want to admit mistakes. So when you're giving feedback to an employee, if they start to get defensive, then the supervisor can actually just ask them very directly, do you think that I'm talking to you about this issue because I want to criticize you or because I want to help support you in becoming more excellent at the job that you're doing and really fulfilling your potential? So when I ask that question, Stephen, how does it come across to you?
Well, it's interesting because it's very consistent in the change. One definitely does either feel like a direct or indirect either there's like a gotcha waiting for you, or something bad's going to happen, and the other one doesn't send off any of those biological defense mechanisms that we have in place. As I think about it, we talk about the fight or flight response. It's that sort of, it can be our instinctual response to some imposing or upcoming threat, and it doesn't give you any of those, it doesn't trigger any of that stuff.
Yes, and it's phenomenal. And for example, one manager was telling me about an issue with an employee who was coming in late all the time, and he hadn't done much about it, and the employee was a very good employee otherwise. But finally, the person came in late so much that supervisor's supervisor noticed it and said, I want you to go ahead and talk to the person about being late. And so he did, and the employee became defensive and said, well, I'm not the only one that's late. Other people are late too. Now, that's a real hook for the supervisor, because it's so easy to say, yeah, but you've been late more often. But now you're countering the other person's position. So if I were going to deal with that, I might ask the question, are you aware that you've been late almost 2 times as often as anyone else in the department? So that I'm asking a question, or how aware are they of how often they've been late compared to other people? If I need to make a statement about it, then I can say directly that when I hear you, and I'm going to show you how you could use either the question or a statement, when I hear you say that other people are late too, and at the same time I'm aware that you have been late twice as much as anyone else in the department. So it seems to me that you're either not aware of that, or perhaps because you do a good job, you've kind of let yourself justify coming in late. And I intend to deal with this issue, not just with you, but with everybody. And it's my hope that you can recognize that this is an issue of significance and that it has an impact on other people as well. I'm not willing to have it continue. And at the same time, I really want to get at the heart of what's going on here that's making you late, so that we can fix it and be done with it and go on. So I added several different little ways you could say that, just so you get impression of different directions you could go. And then you can also, the third form, you can bring in the prediction and say, I think that if you will start coming in on time, you're going to be a little bit less jangled when you go into the meetings that we have in the morning, and things are going to run more smoothly, and I think other people are going to feel that you're respecting their time as well. If you continue to be late, then, and I won't put in a particular consequence here because I don't know in any given environment what consequences are viable, but if you continue to be late, then here's the action I'll take. And the thing about this is, if you notice in all 3 parts, the question, the statement, and the prediction, there is no place where I'm engaging in the power struggle. I'm not biting in. I'm not answering back an argument. I'll either ask another question or I'll make a statement. And when I make that statement, I tell the person what I hear them saying, what I see that may contradict what they're saying, like the person's been late a lot more than other people. What is my conclusion about why this is going on, and what is my own reaction? And we all know that stuff. We can all say, what did the person say with their words? This is something that everybody in your audience can practice. What did the person say with their words? What's wrong with this picture? What do I think is really going on? And what's my reaction? And those 4 simple questions are the kind of thing we do when we vent or when we gossip. We go to someone else and say, well, they said this, but you know what? I think, here's what's really going on, and here's why I think it's happening, and here's my reaction. So we all know how to do that, but we're not just doing it in a respectful way face-to-face with the person.
And it's really, you make it look so easy, but as somebody who's been around this stuff for a long time, that's not an easy. To get to what you've come up with, it's something that I think, I don't know if folks can appreciate what you've done, because, you know, a lot of the dynamics that you were able to either not engage at all or sort of set folks at ease with really trip people up on a regular basis at a very high percentage. You know, like there's a lot of conversations and problems that originate from these things that you're able to avoid.
Yes, and absolutely. And believe me, I do all the things I teach not to do, and we're not always going to be able to remember in the moment to do it differently. It's kind of a chicken and an egg, where if you catch yourself getting defensive, I recommend that we practice lightening up about our defenses, because we're all defensive, you know. I ask people, every audience, how long does it take to get defensive? A nanosecond. How many people on earth get defensive? People usually say everybody, unless they name a spiritual leader they think doesn't get defensive. So it's a massive pandemic problem for all of us. So if we can lighten up a little bit, and when we get defensive, and go back to the person and say, you know, I think I got defensive when you said that to me, but I really would like to ask you a question, or I'd like to finish that conversation. I think we build our character and our personal strength when we do that. And even children can do it. Many of the stories that I have on my website or on my CDs or in my book are from people who heard me for an hour or two. And literally they can go away and begin to practice this. Now, you can do it in isolated instances, but it's like any kind of sport or discipline or spiritual practice or meditation practice, that it takes time to really, really integrate it. But if you like, before we close, I can tell you a story about how a little girl used it just from seeing a note on her mother's refrigerator.
Well, I do indeed. I just want to clarify that we ask folks who are on the show, if you know, for our guests, if they wanted to have an assignment for the week or a call to action, and it sounds like this paying attention to how often we get defensive, would that be the assignment for the week that you would want to have for our listeners?
Yes. It's just to start by observing, stepping outside of yourself and observing. How often do I feel defensive? How often do I feel like I need to justify something? How often do I see someone else reacting defensively? To kind of try to observe from a neutral place, that's great. And then, of course, any of the other things I've said, people can start practicing coming down in a relaxed way when they ask a question. So they can practice any of the things, too, that we've talked about. But that would be a great assignment for the observation.
So yes. Now with that clear, please go ahead and tell us the story of this small child.
A woman who had heard me speak at a conference came up to me at a conference I was speaking at recently in Texas and told me a story about what her fourth grade daughter had done in regard to someone who was bullying her at school. And I asked her if she thought she was telling the story pretty much according to her, be true to her, how her daughter experienced it. And she said, well, I don't know, but why don't you talk to her? So I actually interviewed this child. She's in the seventh grade now, and I know, it's great. She's in the seventh grade now. When she was in the fourth grade, she was new at a school. I call her Gabriella, and the other girl, Hannah. And Hannah came up and started accusing her of things and saying things and bullying her. And Gabriella said, well, at first I just fought back and I said, that's not true and that's a lie. And then I remembered that my mom had this piece of paper, which was actually a summary sheet that's on my website that people can print out about the basic steps in the process. And she said, and it said, ask questions. So I looked at her and I said, why did you say that to me? And she stared at me for a minute, and then she said, I don't know, and she walked off. And then I realized that she didn't know the answer to the question, I started being curious about the answer to my own question, which is phenomenal. Then that means she moved in that moment from judgment and fighting and power struggle. She'd already moved with the question, but she moved to a place of wanting to understand the other human being. And she said, so I remembered that our teacher said that sometimes when kids bully, they have bad things going on at home or things going on at home. So the next day when I saw her, I asked her, is your mommy not spending enough time with you? And she looked at me funny again, and she said, yes, you're right. And then she walked off again. And then the next day, she came and she brought me a card cut out of cardboard, and on it said, "Thank you for seeing into my heart." And we've been friends, ever since. So this child actually asked, I have outlined 14 different ways to ask questions, and she used 2 of them. The first question was about the other child's intention, and the second question was about her own assumption. Maybe she'd had an experience at some point of her mom not spending enough time with her, so she just picked her own assumption and asked about it. And when you think about, I get so many stories back from people where the kinds of conflict that we think could just go on forever or are not easily resolvable, but really she resolved it with just the first question, and then she took it to a whole other level of relationship with the second question.
Well, our time is coming to an end, and I think you've given us a wonderful snapshot into a bit about how the process works and how folks can apply it. I think one of the biggest questions that we haven't answered yet is how can folks get in contact with you?
My website is www.p as in powerful, N as in non, D as in defensive, C as in communication.com. That's Paul, Nancy, David, Connie.com. And there's a place on the drop-down menu that says Learning, and you can either contact me if you're interested in interacting with me about doing something else or asking questions. And then also there's a phone number people can call, which is 510-332-0020, and leave a message.
Well, thank you so much again for being on our program. Any closing thoughts for our listeners?
Well, I think for me, the biggest one is it's really overwhelming to try to change out of being defensive all in one fell swoop. And I think it's important not to judge ourselves and to remember that when we were little kids, before we started walking, if we knew how many millions and billions of steps we'd take in our lifetime, we might never stand up and take the first step. So to really just change things a tiny bit at a time by becoming aware, by practicing a different tone of voice, by thinking about, well, is my intention really to judge you or to control you? What would it look like if I asked a question in a different way? And one question I'll leave people with that people have found very valuable is to ask yourself, if I were truly curious right now, what would I want to know? And that simple question can pop people out of being defensive and reconnect them with their curiosity, and it can make a huge difference in being able to shift in the moment what's happening in a relationship.
Well, Sharon Ellison, thank you so much for being on our program. It was truly a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Take good care.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you've enjoyed the program. You can find over 300 podcasts archived to listen at your own convenience at texasconflictcoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. To learn about upcoming radio programs and resources, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter.